Hi everyone, it's Karl from Mantella Environmental Education. Now in this video we're going to be looking at a completely different type of habitat, and that's bogs. Now everyone's probably heard of a bog, but do you really know how important it is in our natural landscape, the vital functions that it plays, and some of the biodiversity, some of the wildlife that calls this place our home? So the first thing you'll notice looking behind me is it's a very open habitat, so it's very exposed to the elements. There's lots of wind, most importantly there's lots of rain. So bogs are found anywhere in Ireland, north or south, where you get really heavy rainfall throughout the year, lots and lots of rain. And the reason why bogs form in those areas is because bogs are made of a type of soil called peat, and peat only forms in very waterlogged conditions. So there needs to be so much rain throughout the year where normal soils can't form. The soil's continually waterlogged, and that's when peat starts to form. And as we all know, it's a very dark, very rich, fibrous sort of soil that unfortunately for many generations now people have used as a source of fuel to burn in their homes and in factories, as a source of heat and power. And also people would use peat as a type of soil conditioner in their garden, especially if you like to grow acid-loving plants like camellias and rhododendrons. But in this day and age, there are lots of very viable alternatives to both of those old uses of peat, so we don't really need to do that anymore. But unfortunately, a lot of our old bogs in Ireland, all over the island, have been what's called cut over, and that means that they've been cut into to extract the peat for use as fuel or for use as soil in gardens. And as a result, our bogs have been damaged, sometimes irreversibly so. So we're going to look at some of the wildlife that lives on bogs, talk a little bit more about how important bogs are as a wildlife habitat, and also how important bogs are for us. One of the most common plant species you'll find on a bog is heather or calluna. And although it looks sort of purplish brown, little bits of green still remaining, and you can see the old flower head still hanging on there on the end of the stems, doesn't look that interesting at this time of the year. It's gone into its dormant phase of its annual life cycle. In August and early September, there'll be an absolute riot of lilac pinky purple flowers, and it produces really beautiful swathes of colour across our uplands. So this is one species that's very common in our bogs all across Ireland, and this is another one, and this is called reindeer lichen, and it's not actually a plant, it's what's called a dual organism. So lichens are what you get when an algae, a green algae, which is a type of microscopic plant, forms a very special relationship with a fungus, and in that relationship they provide each other with important nutrients that they both need to survive. In that association they form these unique looking organisms called lichens, and this is a reindeer lichen, so called because it grows not just in bogs but up in the north in the tundra, where of course reindeer are native, and this would be the sort of thing that reindeer would feast on, a very, very low nutrient organism that likes really windy exposed conditions. And it's absolutely beautiful. Now if you see lots of this species on a bog, it means that it's very undisturbed. There's not a lot of livestock or people travelling that way, because this little lichen is very easily damaged by lots of people walking on it. Look at that, absolutely beautiful. One of the most important groups of plants you'll find on bogs are a very specialised type of moss called sphagnum mosses. And this particular species, there's lots of different species that grow in slightly different parts of the bog, and this is one that likes to grow in bog pools, little hollows in the peat where the rainwater gathers, and that's the habitat for this. It's called Sphagnum cuspidatum, and the sphagnum mosses in a bog, just like peat, act like a great big sponge, and in areas of heavy rainfall they absorb all that water. And there's a little demonstration just to show that sphagnum literally acts like a sponge, and it holds that rainwater. It then releases it slowly over a period of time into the streams and rivers across the country, and that travels down into the lowlands and eventually out to sea. Now this is another species of sphagnum called Sphagnum capillifolium, and instead of growing in those hollow bog pools filled with rainwater, this sort of wine red species likes to grow on raised hummocks on bogs. And you can see it's a completely different colour to the last species, much smaller as well. So this likes to form drier hummocks on the bog. And just like other sphagnum mosses, acting like a sponge, it actually prevents flooding further downstream in the lowlands and at the coast. And of course, most people live in the lowlands, they live close to the coast, they live in the lower parts of streams and rivers. And so if our bogs are in bad condition, they don't act as a sponge, and all that water gets released very quickly into streams and rivers. We get lots of localised flooding in the lowlands, and that's what's been happening, especially over the last number of years in this part of the world. And one of those reasons is because our bogs in the uplands are in really poor condition, because plants like sphagnum simply aren't there in sufficient quantity, and the peat isn't of sufficient depth anymore due to people cutting it, that it can act like that really effective sponge and hold all that flood water back. This is a classic view of blanket bog that you'll find in our uplands throughout Ireland, north and south, and also towards the west coast. You'll find it in the lowland areas as well, because it's wetter in the west than it is in the east. And it gets the name blanket bog because it literally closes or blankets the ground with a thick layer of peat. I'm very lucky in this case to come across what is quite a rare plant in the north of Ireland nowadays, unfortunately, called Cowberry. And in late summer, early autumn, it gets lovely red berries, which of course some bird species and other animals can eat. But you don't often see this. This is the flower, which usually appears in late spring, early summer. And here it's out in the autumn. It's a little very pale pink, almost white bell-shaped flower. Looks very like the flower you would see on heather. And that's no accident, because it belongs in the same family as heather. Now, Cowberry is what's called an Arctic alpine species. It likes to grow really far north. You'll even see it on some mountain tops. It likes to grow in really remote, rugged areas. So a bog, a windswept blanket bog, is just the place to find it. And the reason it's so rare nowadays is because it really doesn't like being eaten. So if there's any sheep on the hillside on the bog, or any cattle or horses, it gets browsed out very quickly. It doesn't like to be eaten at all. So unfortunately, a lot of our uplands are very heavily grazed, and when that happens, species such as Cowberry here get browsed out of existence, and so it's become, over the generations, what is now a very rare plant species, unfortunately. Another species very characteristic of our bogs is a species called Bog Asphodel, and this species produces beautiful 5-petaled yellow star-shaped flowers in the summertime, and they then mature into orange seed heads in the late summer, early autumn. So this is what it looks like at this time of the year. You see the seed heads are very dry, the seeds are dropped into the peat to germinate perhaps next year, and it produces these very buff coloured iris type leaves you can see in the background. And this species has a local name called bone breaker, and the reason for that is that, as we mentioned earlier on, bogs are very low nutrient environments. There's not a lot of nutrition here to graze livestock like cattle or sheep. And in times gone past, when people did try to graze their livestock on bogs, quite often they would develop brittle bones, and they would maybe fall into a bog pool and snap a leg or something like that. And this particular plant, Bog Asphodel, got the nickname bone breaker because people used to think that when they ate this plant, it'd give them brittle bones, but it's actually all the vegetation on a bog that will give cattle and other livestock brittle bones, because it's so low in nutrients such as calcium, which of course livestock need to build bones. And so bogs are terrible places to graze your livestock. You have to supplement livestock that graze these habitats with mineral blocks and such like, so they get enough nutrition from the vegetation. We've been very lucky to stumble across what is nowadays a very rare plant on our raised bogs. The first thing you'll notice, it's got long, thin, slender leaves, and look very carefully at this particular plant. It also has a little pink flower bud at the top. So just like our cowberry and the blanket bog, this species is going to flower in the autumn time, which is a bit of a strange time of the year for any plant to flower. And those long, narrow leaves are a silvery, a lovely silvery white on the underside of the leaves, which makes them very distinctive. Now, this is such a rare plant nowadays. It's actually protected by law. It's protected by a law called the Wildlife Order, which makes it an offence to pick or uproot or otherwise disturb this species. So bogs are home to some very specialised plants and animals that can live in this very open, windy, rainy, exposed habitat, but also some very rare species, such as Bog Rosemary. So very similar to the reindeer moss, which was actually a species of lichen that we saw in blanket bog, this is a species of lichen that occurs quite commonly on both blanket and raised bogs, and has a very unusual name of devil's matchsticks. And you can see it, the lichen itself has that same silvery green colour as the reindeer moss or reindeer lichen, but it also has these very distinctive scarlet red tips, and those red tips are where the spores are produced. So a lot of fungi and lichens produce their spores, which is their equivalent of plant seeds, during the autumn and the winter time, when of course they're dispersed by the increased wind that we have at this time of the year. Now here's just a few plants of sphagnum, and this plant is Sphagnum papillosum. It's another peat-forming species of sphagnum that we find on bogs. And you notice the green parts of the plant that are actively growing are on the very top, and near the bottom is an olive yellowy brown colour. That part of the sphagnum is actually dead. Now sphagnum moss isn't like plants you have in your garden. The whole plant isn't actually alive at any one time. These bottom parts, the brown parts, are actually dead, and they go right down deep into the peat, and they're slowly over a number of years decomposing. So what that means is that the top part of the plant here is actively growing upwards, and the bottom part of the plant, that brown bit, is actually rotting down very slowly and forming peat. So the top part of the plant is alive, continues to grow, so the bog actually grows upwards over time as the sphagnum and other plants form increasingly thick depths of peat. So it's a really cool plant. Doesn't really have roots as such into the peat like a normal plant would. So the bottom part of the plant actually forms peat, which the top part of the plant actually grows in. So it's a really fantastic little plant indeed. We came to an area of lowland lake just to show an earlier stage in the creation of a lowland raised bog. If you look to the left, you can see that vegetation is growing inwards from the margins of the lake. It's slowly but surely creeping its way into the centre of the lake. And in a period of time, this will develop into a lowland raised bog. Unfortunately, none of us will be alive to see that happening because it takes thousands of years. But this is a very early stage in the formation of a raised bog. Another plant species you'll find in the wetter parts of our bogs has very, very small oval pointed leaves, and it's wild cranberry. Now this isn't the species that gives you your cranberry tea or the cranberries you have with your breakfast. These berries are much, much smaller, and unfortunately there's very few of them around this late in the autumn time, but they're a nice dark red coloured berry that is edible. And just like the bog rosemary that we saw earlier on, this species has silvery undersides to the leaves that you can see there, and they belong in the same family. So we do have a wild cranberry here in Ireland. It's just very, very small, produces very, very tiny but still edible berries. Now here you can see an area of raised bog that has been cut over a period of time, and it's largely bare peat. There's very little vegetation on there at all, and of course when you cut away the peat like this, it's terrible for biodiversity. It's also terrible for us because you're reducing that depth of peat, which means there's much less of a sponge to soak up all our rainwater during storms throughout the year, especially in the autumn and the winter. And that means that there's increased flooding in our lakes and streams and rivers in the lowland areas. Now, one very unusual group of plants which we didn't get to see on our tour of both blanket and raised bogs during this video were plants which don't get their energy or nutrients from the soil like most plants do, but they get them from actually being carnivorous, and that means eating insects and other small animals. So on bogs in Ireland, we have 4 main groups of plants which get their energy in this way. There are the sundews, which have sticky globules of protein digesting chemicals on the end of their leaves, and when a fly or some other small insect lands on those leaves, they curl up and envelope the insect and then digest them into a liquid soup which the plant can absorb. So pretty gruesome, but a very effective way to get protein and other nutrients into your diet if you're a plant living on a very nutrient poor habitat such as a bog. Very similar to that are the butterworts, which have a rosette of pale green leaves which have a sticky substance, not dissimilar to their sundews, on their leaves. And when insects and midges land on the leaves, they just get stuck to the mucus and digested. The leaves on the butterworts don't curl up to digest the insects like they do in the sundews. And then in our bog pools, we have another group of insect-eating plants called the bladderworts, and they have a little bladder, a little sac with a little trigger on the inside, a little hair that acts as a trigger. And when a little aquatic insect like a water flea goes into the bladder, touches that trigger, that hair trigger, the bladder closes, and then inside that bladder the insect gets digested and absorbed by the plant. And the 4th group of insect-eating plants that we have in our bogs are actually invasive non-native species. That means they were introduced from somewhere else in the world and they're not native here in Ireland, north or south, and they're the pitcherplants. And pitcherplants can be found in many of our bogs across Ireland, north and south. So for example in Peatlands Park, which is a really good site to go to in the north of County Armagh, not far from the shores of Lough Neagh, in the little bog garden area of Peatlands Park, which is an area of special scientific interest, you'll see some pitcherplants from North America. And in some of the bogs in the Irish Midlands, there are also the same pitcherplant which have somehow found their way into the wild. So there are 4 groups of carnivorous or insect-eating plants. So unfortunately that concludes our very quick tour of both blanket and raised bogs here in Ireland, and hopefully now you'll realise that although your nearest bog might be miles away from where you are, or where you live, or where you work, by holding back that rainwater, they act like a great big sponge and they protect us wherever we live from flooding events. And unfortunately, because many of our bogs have been damaged over the years, our natural landscape, our natural environment is much less able to absorb a lot of the rainwater that we get nowadays, and as a result, every autumn and winter, or during the summer when we get freak storm events, we do see flooding events in many of our lowland areas. So what I would encourage you to do over the winter and spring and summer is find where your nearest bog is, get permission from the landowner, or if it's a public bog, go around, park the car, walk the dog, go for a walk around the bogs, look for some of the plant species that we've been talking about here on the video, and keep your eyes out also for the many birds and insects and mammals and other really cool and specialised animals that call bogs their home.